The bishop is a chess piece worth 3 pawns which moves like this. It also happens to be Bobby Fischer's favorite chess piece. So in today's video, we're gonna look at the advantages and disadvantages of the bishop as a piece, and then from those advantages and disadvantages, we'll draw some conclusions and principles on how to use the bishop more effectively. Let's begin. First, let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of the bishop. So in the advantages, we have it is a long range piece, which means it can attack from afar. Obviously, due to its diagonal movement, it can influence a lot of things from very far away without actually having to get dirty in the fight. It can support a pawn while supporting itself. So as you see here, the bishop is supporting the pawn as well as supporting itself by the pawn. So these structures are known as crystals, and that makes the bishop a very useful piece to be supported by pawns, especially in the endgame. It is of relatively low value, so it is excellent for tactical motives. Amongst the long range pieces, the bishop is the cheapest one in terms of pawns. So it is great for tactical motives like pin, fork, skewer, and etc. It can be very hard to counter a fianchetto defensive setup. As you can see here, this setup is known as the fianchetto, and it is where the bishop is surrounded by its 3 pawns and the king is castled below them. This structure is very hard to counter as the pawns take care of the dark squares and the bishop takes care of the light squares. So it's very difficult to actually attack this kind of structure. So this is a great defensive structure to employ. And the bishop can also influence both sides of the board at once. Since it's a long range piece, it is especially useful for handling things on both sides of the board. Let's now talk about the disadvantages. It is colorblind, so it cannot control squares of the opposite color. That is very obvious. It is quite useless in closed positions where there are a lot of pawns. That is true because the pawns will obstruct its range and make it a tall pawn. It is vulnerable to capture by the knight since it's worth slightly more. The bishop is worth slightly more than the knight, at least in open positions. So it is actually vulnerable to being captured by the knight since it cannot attack the knight. To know more about the value of the pieces, do check out my video here. Now let's look at the conditions which favor the bishop. It is well placed on long diagonals where the opponent can't attack it. It is better when action is on both sides of the board. Its power is multiplied when in union with its brother. They are also known as the formidable bishop pair. I'm pretty sure you've heard of this term bishop pair, but do you know actually how powerful it is? You see, both these bishops combined control both squares and they are long range pieces. So the bishop pair is actually quite a formidable force, especially in the endgames. Based on our newfound knowledge, we can now condense these facts into 6 simple practical positional principles followed by instructive examples to enable you to use the bishop like a deadly sniper. The first principle is when you have the bishop pair, try to open up the center to maximize their range. So as you can see in this position, white has the bishop pair and he promptly decides to open up the center with f4. So by clearing out the central pawn mass, he can successfully utilize the bishop's long range abilities to wreak havoc on the opponent. So black tries to close the center by playing knight d4, but we simply take the knight and after e takes d4, we play f5. So now you will say that, wait, didn't you just say not to exchange the knight for the bishop? Well, yes, I did, but in this case, the bishop on b3 is having far more potential than the bishop on c3. So it's better to keep the bishop on b3 on the board. So we take with the bishop on c3, he takes and now f5. So our threat is to take fg6 and then the attack from the rook and the bishop will put the f7 pawn under danger. So black plays king h8 so that now when we play f into g6 he'll capture with the f pawn. But instead we change the plans and play f6. Bishop f8 is forced and the black bishop is out of the game. We now play queen f2, trying to redirect our queen to the king side alongside attacking the d4 pawn. Black plays c5 to defend the pawn, and after bishop d5, white is better because his bishop is evidently much better placed than the opposing bishop. It is also on an outpost and it looks at both sides of the board. So we are seeing a lot of the conditions which favor the bishop in action over here, and white eventually went on to win this game. Number 2. Avoid exchanging your bishop for the opponent's knight without a good reason. So as we had seen in the previous example, we had a proper reason to exchange the bishop for the knight. Also, the third principle is to keep your bishop on long open diagonals to maximize its influence. The reason I revealed the third principle right now is because the example we're going to look at takes both of these principles into consideration. So here, as you can see, black has just played h6, asking white the question of whether he wants to trade on f6 or retreat. And yes, you guessed it right, white retreats with bishop f4. Since the knight on f6 is not really doing much, it is obstructed by white's pawns, so it's better to keep the bishop on the board. However, if black decides to trade the bishops with bishop d6, then we can play knight b5, cb5, and now queen c7, bishop c7, bishop c7. And as you can see, black has far too many weaknesses to cope with, and white will easily win this game. So that is why black played queen d8, and now after e4, we have opened up the center due to our lead in development. Also, if you can see, we did not play our bishop to h4 as the bishop is not doing much here. Instead, we take it to f4 where it places it on a long open diagonal from where it slices into the opponent's position. So it restricts a lot of black's movement and it makes it very difficult for black to breathe in his own position. Number 4. Avoid placing your pawns on the same color as your bishop, as this could reduce its mobility. Here, even though white is a pawn up, his bishop is trapped behind its own pawn, and black threatens to play knight c6, knight b4 to seal off the white bishop. Therefore, the best move here would be b4. So we sacrifice the pawn and return it just to activate our bishop. He takes c b4, we play bishop d5. After rook b8, knight f1, we're planning to get our knight to e3 followed by c4, and then we would have a great position. Number 5. The bishop pair is quite a force to reckon with in the endgames. So try to go into an endgame if you possess this dynamic duo. So let's look at a game here. This is the Alapin game, and after d5, which is mainline theory, we have a standard position. After bishop g4, there are two moves for white, bishop e2 and knight c3. So knight c3 is actually giving up a pawn, but it leads to a great position in the endgame. Black thinks that, oh, I can take bishop f3 and I am actually going to be a pawn up. Well, he's right. We have to take gf3, because if we play knight d5, then after bishop d1, knight c7, king d7, knight a8, he saves his bishop, and in fact he traps our knight in the corner when he will have two pieces for the rook, which is not really a great deal. This is why we do not take the queen. Instead, we take the bishop with gf3. He thinks, oh, queen d4 and I'm a pawn up. Well, you're right, he is. But now, if you will have noticed, we have the bishop pair while he doesn't. So instead of thinking that, oh, maybe I'm a pawn down, I should not trade queens, we actually go for it. And after knight b5, black is faced with a myriad of different threats. He has to deal with knight c7, knight e5, and maybe even a bishop coming to h3 sometimes. The bishop can come to b5 if taken. The bishop can come to e3. White can castle long and bring his rook into the game. There are so many opportunities for white here. Let's look at what happens if black plays knight c2 check, king d1, knight a1, and we again also take the rook. But the difference is our bishops here will help us recover the knight on a8, while black's knight on a1 is doomed. e5, bishop e3, b6. So we are threatening to take a7 and get our knight out, so black stops that. We play bishop c4, attacking f7, f6, king d2, threatening to take the knight on a1, bishop b4 check, king d3, and the knight on a1 is gone. King c8, rook into a1, king b7, and bishop d5 check. We managed to save our knight, and at the very least we will get 2 pawns for it when our bishop pair will decide the game. And the last principle, which is the sixth one, if the opponent has the bishop pair, try to exchange at least one of the bishops. So in this position, black has the bishop pair and could even potentially open up the center with e5 or continue with his queenside minority attack of b5. White decides that his bishop on b3 is not doing much, so he trades it off for the bishop on g6. After knight e7 takes, rook e1 b5 queen d3, we're attacking b5, so he cannot play a5 and continue with his plan. He can play rook b8, and after a3 a5 knight f1 takes and knight e3, and after queen c7 rook a c1. It's not completely winning for us, but we're better off because he can't do much with only one bishop as compared to what he could do with both the bishops. And in this position we can now play c4 and try to simplify things in the center and get some counterplay. Had we not traded the bishops, then black would have been in a much better state here. Well, that's it for today, friends. Please make sure to like and subscribe so I can keep making content like this. Until then, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.